Hello everyone. In the last class we were discussing about policy monitoring and its different approaches. So we started with the managerial approaches, right? And under managerial approaches we have already discussed the critical path method. We are done with it. Okay. So today we'll be discussing the other two methods under this managerial approaches, that is program evaluation and review technique and the planning, programming, budgeting systems. Okay. So apart from these managerial approaches, we will be also discussing system approach, formative approach, performance measurement approach as part of our monitoring exercises. Okay. So let's discuss the second approach under this managerial approach, that is program evaluation and review technique. Okay, PERT. So what is this PERT? So this PERT is a statistical tool. Okay. So that is commonly used in project management. Okay. And if you see the PERT, then it tries to analyze and represent, right, the different tasks that is involved in the project, and by analyzing and representing this task, we can also predict the duration of the critical activities even under uncertainty conditions. Okay, so that is again to be highlighted that this PERT can deal with the uncertainty conditions, right. So that is the reason it is another popular managerial approach used by the policymakers or the project managers. Okay. And moreover, since it can predict the duration of critical activities, so that is the reason this particular tool PERT involves estimation of time and estimation of the resources. So both time and resources which are necessary for the execution of a policy or a program. Okay. So based on this understanding that what exactly is PERT, now we can think about the applications of the PERT, or how can we proceed with the application of PERT, what are the steps involved. So since I told you that the PERT can also deal with it can also be applicable under the conditions of uncertainty. So that is the reason and this PERT systems are programmed, right, based on three types of uncertainty calculations. Okay. So which are those three types of calculations of uncertainty? So the first one that PERT can program, right, based on the first uncertainty calculation, that is the most probable duration. Okay. And the second one is the shortest forecast of a duration, and the last one is the longest forecast of duration. Okay. So this is like most probable is most likely duration a policy or program, and the shortest forecast duration is more optimistic in nature, right, and the longest forecast duration is a kind of pessimistic in nature. Okay. So this most probable is like a common situation or in a normal situation. Okay. Okay. So that is the reason we can say, since PERT systems are programmed based on these three different scenario calculations, that is the reason we can say that this tool allows to be applied under the conditions of uncertainties, because we take into account the optimistic conditions as well as the pessimistic conditions for the policy. Okay. So this particular feature of uncertainty or dealing or handling with uncertainty is also acknowledged by many authors, just like R.K. Sapru also acknowledged that PERT is usually used in policy programs where there is large degree of uncertainty. Okay, so given this understanding, now we can take an example that how this program evaluation and review technique estimates the three scenarios. Okay. And how can we find that whether large degree of uncertainty is there or we can find a lesser degree of uncertainty. Okay. So for PERT estimates we need expected time. Okay. So we have to find out the expected time for a specific task using this probability based weighted average of three estimates that we have already discussed. That what are the three estimates used: optimistic estimates, okay, most likely estimates, and the pessimistic estimates. Okay. Optimistic estimates are the best, or you can say this is the second one, that shortest forecast of a duration, right, and most likely is the first one, that is the most probable duration, and the longest forecast of duration is the pessimistic estimates. Okay. So given these three estimates, three probability based weighted average estimates, we can find out what is the expected time for a specific task, since we are discussing about the policy implementation or program implementation. Okay. So, when these three estimates are given, so we can find out the PERT estimates, that is the expected time, which is denoted by TE. Okay. So, how to calculate? So, TE can be calculated by taking into account the optimist estimates, 4 times of most likely estimates, and the pessimist estimates. So, we are adding it up and divided by 6. Okay. So, this O stands for the best case scenario. If everything is running perfectly, that is the optimistic result or best scenario result for everything. Okay, given that everything would be in ideal situation or running perfectly. Then the second one, that is M, the most realistic or frequent duration under normal conditions. So, it is most likely. And the P is the worst case scenario, that is it is a case of pessimistic scenarios. If there would be delays in the major execution of the program, or there could be complications or uncertainty, high level of uncertainty may happen. Okay. So, based on this understanding, now we can see this is the divider 6. Okay. So, this divider 6 is the beta distribution of the denominator, right, which is used to calculate the mean. Okay. So, in case of this beta distribution, we used to do this. So, that is the reason. So, 6 is divider. So, that represents the beta distribution denominator, which is used to calculate the mean here, right. And for uncertainty, then we can also calculate the variance, right. So, the variance can be calculated based on the two extremes, one, that is the optimistic estimates and the pessimistic estimates. Okay. So, since it is beta distributed denominator, so that is the reason 6 is divided here. So, pessimistic minus optimistic divided by 6, right, whole square. So, that is giving the variance. So, you can say that standard deviation is P minus O divided by 6, okay, and variance is standard deviation square, that means P minus O divided by 6 square. Okay. So, given this understanding and given this formula, then I think you can apply. So, suppose say the optimistic estimate is, let us say 12 weeks, okay, most likely is, let us say 16 weeks, and pessimistic estimates is, let us say 22 weeks. Okay. So, given these estimates, okay, now we can find out what is the expected time for this specific program or the task that we are discussing here. Okay. So, you can just put the values and you can find out that what is the expected time. So, likewise, in order to check the variance, we can do this exercise, that is P minus O. So, here 22 minus 12 divided by 6, right, whole square. So, you can find out the variance as well. So, that will be giving you a picture of uncertainty. Okay. So, now we can move to the last method under the managerial approach for policy monitoring or program monitoring, is planning, programming and budgeting system. Okay. So, as the name suggests, right. So, you can find there are 3 very important concepts used here for monitoring exercises. The first one is planning, programming, and the third one is budgeting. Okay. So, the monitoring exercises in the policy as per this approach is based on these 3 key areas, that your planning should be adequate, okay, and beforehand, and the programming should be in a sequenced way, and the budgeting part you need to take care. Okay. So, again this planning, programming and budgeting system is a management tool, as I told you that it is a managerial approach. So, which can provide a better analytical basis for decision making and also taking decisions into operations. Okay. And again this planning, programming, budgeting system, as I told you, it takes care of 3 distinct administrative functions to monitor and execute the policies, and also tries to optimize the resource allocation. Okay. So, this is the 3 distinct administrative functions are the planning, programming and budgeting. Okay. So, under planning, what exactly is to be done for monitoring the policies or programs or a particular task. So, under this planning, there is a need to identify, okay, and also there is a need to define the objectives, identification and definition of the long term objectives of that said policy or program is to be done. Okay. So, once this is done, then in this planning stage there is a need to assess that what exactly is the demand or the need of the society, right, and how the needs of the society are going to be achieved or are reflected in terms of the objectives of that particular policy or plan. Okay. And the third one is that for achieving this long term objectives, which is said to be based on the societal needs or demand, right. So, in order to achieve this, there should be set of strategic actions or strategic goals. Okay. So, all these three things are falling under the planning. Okay. Then the second aspect of this managerial approach is programming. Okay. So, what is this programming? So, programming is something like that you need to take actions in a strategic way. Okay. Or the strategy should be goal oriented and actionable. So, programming translates the strategic goals into actionable and also multi-year programs, because when we have already identified that or emphasized that the objective should be long term, right. So, objective can span across time, let us say from T1 year to T10 year. Okay. So, the programming should be in such a way that the adequate strategic goals should be formulated, which are said to be actionable, and these strategies should be addressing or implemented over all these targeted years. So, multi-years programs needs to be taken, which can determine the scope of the activities and the estimates. Okay. So, basically we can find what are the strategies that can be taken, right, over this year. So, let us say for T1 year, what are the strategies that we are taking, T2 years, what are the strategies that you are taken, and likewise for T10 years. Okay. And sometimes we also go for a cluster based approach. So, there we have to take into account, let us say that similar kind of activities are to be taken in both the years, let us say T1 and T2, right. So, and that is the reason the strategies should be uniform or similar strategies are to be followed over these years. Okay. So, this is a part of our programming which translates the strategic goals into actionable tasks. Okay. And the last one, that it is not only to determine the activities and estimates, but also it estimates that what are the likely resources, okay, that would be required for doing the strategic actions, okay, for achieving the long term objectives. So, and the last one, since we discussed about that for programming also we are requiring resources, for planning also we are requiring resources. Okay. So, that should be addressed through the last step, that is the budgeting. So, the budgeting converts the approved programs into specific the financial allocations. Okay. So, that by doing a cost benefit analysis of all these resources that we are allocating, okay, then we need to ensure that this allocation of resources should be optimized, okay, for doing this programming and also planning. Okay. So, this is how we can say that under this planning, programming and budgeting system, we can also be followed for monitoring a particular task or program or policy, right, involving adequacy in planning, programming and also the budgeting. And the last part is the budgeting, which emphasizes that the financial allocations should be optimized and financial allocation should be based on the analysis of benefit and cost. Okay. And so, this planning, programming and budgeting approach, right, it focuses on the objectives that can be achieved, and it also monitors the implementation of the projects or the policies and also reviews the results. Okay. So, that means one thing is clear for all of us, that if a manager is following this planning, programming and budgeting approach for policy monitoring, then the monitors would be able to set clear goals through this approach of planning, programming and budgeting. Okay. So, it helps to set clear goals, right, and also it seeks that what would be the expected outputs and what are the values or what would be the values that are necessary in budgetary processes. So these three things are very important if you are following this planning, programming and budgeting, and they are helpful in doing these exercises. Okay. So the same thing is also being acknowledged by Arkis Apru, right, while mentioning about this planning, programming and budgeting approach as the policy monitoring approach. So he mentions that by this planning, programming and budgeting approach creates system of analysis, and also it reviews the cost and benefits of a particular policy and particular program. Okay, and this cost and benefits can be calculated over the several years because it is a multi-year program, or the task or program can spread across years. Okay, so that is the reason. Suppose say, as I told you, that this policy under consideration that we are discussing, or program under consideration, can spread from T1 year to T10 year. Right. So every year we are finding there could be some cost that needs to be spent or incurred, and there could be the likely benefits. Okay, there could be cost and there could be benefits. So every year we will be anticipating there could be some cost and there could be some benefits. Okay, so every year we have to do this benefit cost analysis. Okay, so by calculating the benefit and cost analysis for the entire study period or entire project period, right, we have to take a decision. So far the budgetary allocation is concerned. Okay, so we are done with the first approach, that is managerial approach. And in managerial approach we mentioned about three approaches. The first one is the critical path method, right, the second one is PERT, program evaluation and review technique, and the third one is planning, programming, budgeting. Okay, done. So apart from these managerial approaches, which are known to be the very popular approach in policy monitoring, we have some other approaches as well, okay, in policy monitoring. So the next one that we will be discussing is the system approach. Okay, so what is this system approach? So as we understand that, again we can go back to the nomenclature or name of this particular approach, that is system. So when you are thinking about a system, the system consists of multiple units. Okay, but however, this, although they are multiple units, but they are integrated, and that is the reason it is counted as a system. Okay, so the system has a particular system can have multiple subsystem or multiple elements which are interdependent and they also interact. Okay, so based on this understanding, that now we can discuss about the system approach and how is it helpful in policy monitoring. Okay, again this system approach is very popular method or widely accepted method for addressing the problems. Basically those problems which considers the multiple and interacting relationships. So that is the reason it is system. So there are multiple relationships among the multiple system or multiple units. Okay, and this multiple units which constitute a system, this is a larger system, they also interact with each other. Okay, so if this is the case, then the best approach for monitoring a particular project or a policy is the system approach. Okay, which can take care of the multiple relationships or multiple interacting relationships. Okay, then again this and monitoring exercise becomes the operational activity that can occur in the process of implementing a particular policy or program. Okay, and the main objectives of this system approach is how best the resource inputs or resources can be utilized to achieve the best result or best policy output. So that is why we are discussing about the system approach for policy monitoring. Okay, so basically in system approach we are emphasizing on the best use of the resources that is allocated for under that policy implementation or a specific program implementations. Okay, and if you want to see that through this particular method of system approach, the monitoring should be effective. Okay, so for effective monitoring we need a condition. What is the condition? That condition is proper structuring. Okay, so if there is proper structuring, then through this system approach the monitoring could be effective. Okay, so again when you say that we need a structure approaching, right, or structuring. So what is this structuring? So this structuring can also be understood in two, or it can have two dual approach. So it emphasizes on two types of structuring. The first one is structuring of the organization and the second one is the structuring of the policy programs. Okay, and if we integrate both, when we combine both, then it provides a complete framework for the integration, and we can go for using it for policy monitoring. Okay, so when we are using this structuring approach, structuring looks or appears like as if we can find the gaps in implementation. So that is the reason when we do go for structuring, then it helps in policy in identifying the implementation gaps. Okay, so the implementation gaps, when once identified, they can be analyzed, right? And since we are discussing the entire system, right, so the entire system may be also taken into account, right, through these structuring approaches. And for the entire system, we can find out what may be the gaps or what are the gaps, so that it can be identified through feedbacks. We can rethink about how the gaps can be minimized at any subsystem. Those are the part of the system. Okay, so that the policy programs, policy delivery or program delivery can happen smoothly. Okay, so if you are, let's say this system is monitored by an analyst, right? So the analyst perceive that how the total sequence of the program activities and inputs and outputs contribute to the success or the failure of the program through this system analysis. Okay, because system analysis allows this implementation gap, identification of the gap and implementation gap through the structuring of the organization, structuring of the policy or program. So that is the reason. So taking the perspective of a system analyst, right, so we can say that if he can find out how the total sequence of the program activities or policy activities along with the inputs and outputs can be analyzed, then we can find whether the policy or program is a success or failure. Okay, so the best part is that through the system analysis, we can find the progress of the policy implementation, and we can also identify that what are the gaps. Okay, so accordingly we can fix those gaps and also analyze that whether the policy program would be a success or failure. Okay, so before understanding the other approach like formative approach, so we can also think about its applicability of this system approach. Why at all we need to think about this system approach in a policy context or program context. Okay, so since in a real life, right, policies are very interrelated. Okay, so we cannot think about that X policy is standing alone. Okay, there is no such thing, because X policy is interrelated with the other societal and policy context. Okay, so the system approach basically study the interrelated variables that constitute one system, one society. Okay, and you can think about it, the system approach also consists of very visible and what you can say consistent patterns, right, which may interact with each other and also give a picture of self-regulating the order as well. Okay, and that is the reason this system approach also perceives that society and the government, right, they are very complex and they are interconnected, right, and interdependent as well. For example, we can take the case, instead of isolating the specific problems, like let's say pollution is a very common problem, so how to handle pollution. Okay, so maybe handling pollution problem would be an easier activity through taxation system. Okay, so if it is so, then we are doing a mistake. Okay, so what exactly the system approach is perceiving, so for fixing the pollution problem is concerned. So instead of isolating the specific problems like pollution, right, handling the pollution problem by the taxation system, the system approach analyzes the broader dynamics of pollution, right, what are the causes of the pollution, how pollution is interlinked with development, with the distribution, with region specific, right, and what are the loopholes, what you can say actionable activities that can be taken by the government, whether the pollution problem is only confined to a subnational or a national government or it is beyond that. So the system approach is helpful in understanding all these aspects. Okay, so basically we can, if you are following this system approach, then it is helpful to understand that a particular policy is not a standalone policy, a process or an outcome, but it involves a dynamic of interconnectedness that may change the very balance of the entire system. So, if you are doing any of the policy exercises in one subsystem, so it may impact the entire system under this subsystem. Okay, so that is the reason we need to be very careful in understanding the interactive effect or interaction, right, among the interrelated systems. Okay, and moreover, by using this system approach, it evaluates how inputs like your policy needs or policy demands or resources are converted into outputs in terms of policies or laws. So, that is the reason this system approach has what you can say greater relevance in today's society as well, right? We are finding that there are many hierarchy of relationships, there are many subsystems in a particular systems. Okay, so the importance of this approach in democratic societies and the government is, we can say that this particular approach is very helpful in preventing the governments from creating any policy which are just a cause and effect relationship. Okay, so many times we are creating a policy, right, which can deal with cause and effect, right? If there is a cause, if there is a need, if there is a problem, then in order to solve that problem, we need the policy which are expected to produce the effect. So, that kind of policies are created. Okay, but by if you follow this system approach, then it prevents the governments for creating just cause and effect policies that merely address what you can say the symptoms, the problems, right, which may shift from one system to another. Okay, and that is the reason the system approach plays a very essential role in understanding the interplays of policies. Okay, the role of interplays in policy interplay, right? So, addressing that what are the synergistic roles of one policy with another policy, or what are the trade-off roles in from one policy to another policy. So, if we analyze this or if you take the framework of this system approach, then it is helpful to understand the entire system rather than a specific cause and effect kind of relationship in designing the cause and effect kind of a policy. Okay, so that is the reason we can say that it is giving us a broader picture of this system and accordingly how the policies can be designed. Okay, so given this understanding that how this system approach is applicable or can also be essential in day-to-day life, like in the current context, now we can move to discuss about the formative approach. Okay, so what is this formative approach? Again, this formative approach takes into account some management steps so that the execution of the policy can happen. Okay, and in the formative approach, we start with scheduling of activities and works for the success of a particular policy or program, right? When the policy and program is implemented and the monitor is asked to monitor, then of course the first thing that should be taken into account is the scheduling of activities. Okay, and thereby when we say that the scheduling of activities need to be done, so it creates conditions and also promotes the successful implementation of that said policy or program. Okay, so however the necessary thing that is needed, okay, necessary thing, urgent work that is to be done is scheduling of activities. So, when you say scheduling of activities, so it requires a lot of information, right, that needs to be collected and also needs to be stored. Okay, so that means management of information system is required. Okay, in this formative approach. So, this MIS or management information system is becoming very critical because it is a kind of centralization of information system. Okay, and accordingly you can deal with that what next to be done. So, this formative approach creates a lot of information, right, or you can say collection of data and information, okay, screening of data to the production of information, and also it is helpful in taking the managerial decisions and the progress of the decisions through the MIS, through the required information at every stage of a policy. Okay, so since this is needed, this formative approach is needed at every stage of policy. So, of course, it will be helpful in developing efficiency in monitoring the policy as well. Okay, So now again, since we are discussing about this formative approach, okay, and the major thing that we discuss is that it is based on the scheduling, and for scheduling it needs a lot of data and information, and for collecting and managing the data we need to have a proper management information system, and this formative approach is emphasizing on that aspect, that how a lot of data can be collected and how those data can be managed. Okay, so based on this understanding, now we can think about the application part of this formative approach and what could be the difference between the formative approach and the system approach. Okay, so we have already done with the system approach. Since we are discussing that this formative approach, let's discuss about some of the applications of the formative approach as well. Okay, so if you see the formative approach, then it focuses on a continuous learning. So that is the reason it is emphasizing on the scheduling. Okay, so when we started, the first thing that we had described, the first feature that we described, or the first thing that was required is scheduling, right? So when a monitor takes into account the framework of formative approach, so that means it emphasizes on the continuous learning, continuous adaptation and continuous improvement, right, during the implementation phase of a particular policy, particular plan or program. Okay, so since it emphasizes on scheduling and continuous learning, then we can say that continuous collection of data and information is required. That means continuous collection of feedbacks is required, because at every stage of policy implementation we are collecting the data, right? So when we are collecting the data, so we are also analyzing the data, right, and we can also find out the feedback on every stage of the policy implementation. Okay, so by doing this exercise, I think the policymaker can find out or can track the policy's progress on a real time basis, because every time, right, every stages of a policy, at every point of time the data and information is collected, and once the data and information is collected, then of course the feedback is collected. So that means this real time monitoring and tracking of the policy implementation is happening if the policy monitors adheres to this particular approach and identify. Thereby you can think about the, if there are any flaws at all, right, existing at any stage or at any point of time, then it is easier on the part of the monitors to identify that, and accordingly it can adjust through funding, through resources, through strategies, right, or through the guidelines. Okay, so we can say in one line that this formative approach minimizes the risk and also avoids the catastrophic failure of a policy. Okay, so again, when policy fails, then of course it entails a lot of cost. So that is the reason, if a monitor is taking this approach of formative or formative approach, then of course the lot of money is saved, lot of resources are also saved, and the best part of the thing is that the policy monitor also avoids the catastrophic failure of the policy. Okay, so that is the reason I think in today's world we can also emphasize on this formative approach as one of the policy monitoring approach, or once the policy is implemented, then we can also take this approach for our monitoring. And the last two approach that we will be discussing today is performance measurement approach. So what is this performance measurement approach? So performance measurement approach again is based on the performances, and for performances we have to take into account some of the indicators or sometimes index. Okay, and so this particular approach is employed to check the effectiveness and efficiency of the policy delivery systems. Okay, and here when you are saying that performance is measured, right, so when you are measuring, then it is very close to monitoring, right. So that is the reason sometimes it is taken as a measurement approach and sometimes it is taken as a monitoring approach as well. Okay, so this performance measurement approach takes into account the performance indicators that I just was briefing you, that we have to take into account the indicators, right, or sometimes indices on the parameters that we want to highlight upon, and thereby we can find out the, or we can identify if at all there is any deviation in the particular policy implementation or program implementation through these indicators. Okay. So let's say that we are implementing a policy related to education. Okay. So what are the likely outcomes or what are the targets of this education policy? That there should be 100% retention, right? Retention of students, right? And the second could be the attendance should be nearly 100%. Okay. There should be scholastic development of students. Okay. So given these broad goals, okay, so of this policy, so now we can think about what are, so if at all we want to see that what is the success, to what extent this policy is successfully being implemented, we have to take into account these indicators. So we have to identify some of the sub indicators under these variables and we can monitor those, and if at all we are finding some deviations that in this particular variable or parameter, in this particular indicator there are some gaps, okay, which is leading to deviation in the expected result. So then at a very early stage we can identify the gaps and accordingly the appropriate actions can be taken into account so that the policy implementation would be smooth and efficient. Okay. So as I am just discussing about that, if at all we are able to identify any deviations, right, so the implementers are asked to take adequate task so that it can influence and also change the parameters, right, so that the desired course of actions can be achieved in the targeted point of time. Okay. So what is the main argument of this performance measurement approach? The main argument of this approach is that instead of taking profit as a indicator, right, for the success or failure of a policy or a project, so we can also take into account the performance as a substitute. Okay. So performance can provide a substitute for profit. Okay. And the application of the performance measurement approach are really very wide. Okay. So we can think about the application of this approach in schooling system, in education system, in hospital system, and even the local government system. So there could be many multiple aspects where the performance measurement approach is being applied. So given this understanding, the last part that we need to highlight is what is the benefit of this performance indicators. Okay. So when we are saying that if you have to identify whether the policy implementation is a success or a failure or it needs any kind of change or intervention, so we have to take into account this some or other kinds of indicators. So those are known as the performance indicators. Okay. So by collecting data on performance indicators, we actually increase the accountability of that particular project implementations. Okay. And this performance indicators, they can also provide a very grounding or a base for the policy planning and control. They can provide the information in monitoring the organizational activities. They can also provide the basis for appraisal system. Let's say there are employees in the organization or the staffs in the organization system. So how their performance can be measured, okay, so that the organization can sustain, right, or the organization can progress as well. So for that also we are needing this employee appraisal system or staff appraisal systems. Okay. And the other benefits of these performance indicators is that it also helps to determine the progress, identify the problem areas, and also contribute the improvement areas in the personnel, the officers management system. So in practice we can say this performance indicators can help in improving the capacity of the organization, and if it is the government level, then it is the capacity of the bureaucracy, right, and if it is a kind of organization or institutions for monitoring, then you can say for controlling the organizations and controlling the people also, this performance indicators are the best system for monitoring the programs or policy. Okay. So you can refer to these two books by R.K. Sapru, Public Policy Art and Craft Policy Analysis, and the second one is the Policy Formulation, Implementation and Evaluation. Okay. So thank you very much. If you have any questions or queries, then you can get back to us through our question answer session and also through emails. Thank you.